By the time I got home that Thursday, I was running on fumes. 12 hours on a fabrication site will do that to a man, especially when the whole day's been spent bent over steel, grinding edges, fitting brackets, and listening to your lower back complain louder than your tools. My gloves were stiff with grime, my shirt smelled like burned metal and machine oil, and my boots were carrying half the day home with them in the form of mud and sawdust. I turned into my driveway expecting exactly two things: quiet and a shower. Instead, I hit the brakes so hard my coffee thermos rolled off the passenger seat. There, parked squarely inside my detached workshop, was a silver luxury sedan I had never seen before. Not near the workshop, not partly inside, centered like it belonged there. Engine cold, windows up, no note on the windshield, no one around. And then I noticed the gate. The lock on my gate had been changed, not cut, not broken, replaced, on my property. That gravel lane, I laid it myself, hauled the stone, leveled the grade, packed it down over years. That workshop, I built it with my father's help, every beam, every weld, every inch of it. It wasn't just a building where I worked, it was mine in a way some people will never understand. And somebody had decided they had a right to it. Her name was Beverly Danner. Every subdivision has one person who mistakes a volunteer HOA title for a royal appointment. In my neighborhood, that person was Beverly. Retired, overpressed, always carrying a folder or clipboard, always speaking in that careful voice people use when they're trying to sound reasonable while doing something insane. She'd moved into the neighborhood 2 years earlier and somehow turned a sleepy homeowners association into a low-budget dictatorship. Basketball goals became visual clutter. Pickup trucks parked too long became community compliance concerns. One old widow got a warning because her son's work van sat in her driveway for 4 days. I'd already had run-ins with Beverly before. First, she tried citing me for a propane tank stored behind a privacy fence, legally, correctly, and in full compliance with code. I sent back permit documents and a letter from my attorney. She backed off, but not gracefully. After that, I started noticing her slowing down in front of my place, looking, assessing, waiting. What she didn't like was my workshop. It sat behind my house on a permitted lot, a detached steel structure where I ran my mobile welding and fabrication business. It was legal, insured, inspected, and county approved. But to Beverly, anything that didn't fit her vision of polished suburban sameness was a personal offense. So when I saw that car sitting on my shop floor, I didn't think accident. I thought move. Taped to the workshop door was a document in a plastic sleeve. It was an HOA resolution. I stood there reading it twice because I genuinely thought my brain had shorted out from exhaustion. The document claimed that the gravel lane running alongside my house was now considered a shared community access route under a newly adopted neighborhood easement policy. According to this paper, the HOA had authority to regulate use, designate access, and make temporary or permanent accommodations for community utility and parking needs. Parking needs, meaning that car, meaning they had decided my property was now neighborhood overflow. I laughed. Not because it was funny, because sometimes when something is stupid enough, your body has no better response. I took pictures first. That's one thing trade work teaches you. Before you react, document. I photographed the car from every angle, the changed lock, the gate chain, the notice on the workshop, tire marks in the gravel, even the cold engine hood. Then I called my business partner, Trent, and told him not to bring materials by the next morning. Then I called my attorney. Her name was Rosalind Voss, and she had the kind of voice that got calmer the worse things were. I read the resolution aloud. She let me finish and then said, "Do not touch the vehicle. Do not confront her alone. Take photos of everything. I'll start pulling the county records tonight." I asked if I should call the sheriff. She said yes, but she already knew what was likely to happen. And she was right. The deputy who came out gave the whole situation one tired look and immediately shifted into civil matter mode. He looked at the paper Beverly had posted, looked at the car, looked at my permits, and suggested I work it out through HOA channels unless there's immediate danger. Immediate danger. There was a stranger's car inside my locked work building. But I understood the message. He wasn't going to be the one to untangle it. Fine. After he left, I walked the perimeter of the workshop and noticed something else. The side gate latch had fresh tool marks. Whoever changed the lock had done it neatly, deliberately, like this had been planned in advance. Inside the house, Marlene met me at the kitchen table with that expression that meant she was angry on my behalf, but waiting to hear how bad it was. I slid the pictures across the table. She stared at them for a long time. Then she said, "She put her car in your shop." "Looks like that," I said. "And changed your gate lock?" "Yep." Marlene leaned back in her chair and laughed once, hard and sharp. That woman finally lost what little mind she had. Maybe she thought nobody would stop her. That night, while the house settled and the refrigerator hummed and the neighborhood went quiet, I started making a file. Printed photos, notes, dates, prior notices, my permits, survey records, copies of the original property line documents, every interaction I had ever had with Beverly that was in writing. By midnight, I had a stack going. At 8:12 the next morning, Rosalind called me back. She said, "I pulled the governing documents, and this gets better. There was no authority in the HOA bylaws to create a private easement across an owner's lot without written consent. Worse for Beverly, my workshop access fell under county zoning because of its permitted commercial accessory use. The HOA could whine about appearances all day, but they could not legally seize access or convert my private drive into shared property by board vote. In other words, the whole thing was fake. Not mistaken. Fake. Rosalind drafted a formal notice by noon. It informed Beverly and the HOA that the resolution was invalid, that the car was trespassing on private property, and that they had 48 hours to remove it before we filed in county court. We sent it certified. Beverly responded the next day by showing up on my front porch in a cream-colored jacket, holding a folder like she was arriving to close a merger. She smiled through the screen door and told me the board was merely clarifying the common benefit function of my driveway, and if I escalated this unnecessarily, the HOA would consider enforcement actions related to commercial misuse of my structure. I looked at her for a second. Then I raised my phone. "Rosalind," I said clearly, "she's here now, and she just threatened retaliation." Beverly's smile disappeared so fast it was almost impressive. She turned and walked away without another word. But she didn't move the car, and that was when I stopped thinking about this as a disagreement. This was a siege. If Beverly wanted a fight, she'd picked the wrong man's building, because while she was still playing paperwork queen, Rosalind was digging through county records, and I was about to learn this was bigger than one car in one workshop, much bigger. And once I found out what Beverly was really after, I stopped wanting her Lexus gone right away. I wanted it exactly where it was, because that car was about to become evidence. What my attorney uncovered in the county files changed everything. Beverly wasn't just overstepping, she had a reason for targeting my workshop, and once I saw it, I realized the Lexus in my building wasn't a mistake, it was bait. And in part 2, I'll show you the document that exposed her real plan. The morning after Beverly came to my porch pretending this was all normal, I stopped seeing the silver sedan in my workshop as an inconvenience. It had become a marker, proof, a planted flag in a land grab she had no right to make. And while she was still operating like intimidation would carry the day, Rosalind was doing what good property lawyers do best, pulling records until the lies started collapsing under their own weight. By that afternoon, she called with the first crack in Beverly's little empire. The so-called HOA resolution was junk. Not just weak, not questionable, void. The neighborhood covenants clearly required written notarized consent from any homeowner before an easement could be created over private property. Beverly had no consent from me because she had never even asked. She had simply assembled 2 board signatures, dressed the document in formal language, and acted as if that transformed fiction into law. It didn't. But that was only the surface problem. The deeper issue, and the part Beverly either didn't understand or hoped nobody else would, was that my workshop had county-recognized commercial accessory status. That mattered, because once zoning and permitted use enter the picture, an HOA's authority gets much narrower than people assume. They can nag over appearances, sure, paint color, visible storage, mailbox nonsense, but they cannot override county-recognized use rights by inventing access claims. Rosalind said something that stuck with me. Bad HOA leaders survive on people not reading their own documents. That line explained half my neighborhood. Most folks are busy. Jobs, kids, medical stuff, bills, life. Beverly counted on that. She relied on nobody having the time or energy to challenge formal-looking nonsense. She used paper like a weapon, because paper scares people when it arrives with bold headings and fake certainty. Unfortunately for her, she'd aimed that tactic at a man with permits, records, and a lawyer who enjoyed this sort of thing. I kept building the file. I pulled my original workshop permit, my business registration, insurance certificates, property surveys, every tax record tied to the detached structure. I even dug out old invoices for gravel deliveries and gate installation just to establish a clean timeline of what existed and when. Then I found something useful in the trash. Beverly, or somebody working with her, had tossed the packaging from the replacement gate lock in the community recycling bins near the mail kiosk. That may sound minor, but packaging tells stories. Brand, model, purchase label, sometimes date tags. I retrieved it with gloves, photographed it, and bagged it. When somebody invades your property with confidence, they usually leave a trail because they assume they'll never be questioned. Meanwhile, Beverly was still escalating. 2 days after receiving the formal demand letter, she filed a written HOA complaint against my workshop, claiming I was operating a business illegally in a residential subdivision and threatening fines if I didn't cease non-conforming activity. That would have been laughable on its own, but the timing got more interesting because that same afternoon, a county code officer rolled up to my gate. He introduced himself, said he'd received an anonymous complaint about unauthorized commercial operations, and asked if I had permits. I did. I showed him everything through the gate before I even let him onto the lane. He checked the documents, checked the parcel record on his tablet, and his whole posture changed. This was not a man uncovering a violation. This was a man realizing he'd been sent on a fool's errand. Before leaving, he said, "Looks like you're in order." I wrote down the exact time and took a photo of his vehicle as it exited. Rosalind added that to the file under a phrase I'd never heard before: administrative harassment. That's when people weaponize systems, not to win legitimately, but to bury somebody in distractions, inspections, response deadlines, and procedural headaches. Even false complaints consume time. They create stress. Sometimes they trip people up. Only Beverly had a problem. I'm meticulous. Comes with fabrication work. If your measurements are sloppy, steel will embarrass you in public. So my paperwork stayed tighter than she expected. Then my neighbor Hank came over. Now Hank was the kind of guy who noticed things but didn't volunteer them unless they mattered. Retired machinist, quiet voice, memory like a ledger. He stood in my driveway looking at the workshop for a while before saying, "You're not the only one." Turns out Beverly had been sending warning letters to half the block. Mailbox placement, decorative lighting, fence trim, a tiny trailer, garden border stones, tiny useless complaints all clustered around one interesting fact: HOA board elections were coming up. Hank also knew something I didn't. The HOA budget included a yearly neighborhood improvement fund, a decent chunk of money, and nobody had seen a proper accounting of where it was going. That got my attention, because once somebody comfortable with fake authority starts handling money in the dark, you no longer have a personality problem. You may have a legal one. So Rosalind sent a records demand. In Ohio, homeowners can request certain association financial disclosures, and boards don't get to ignore those requests forever. Once the clock starts, it starts. We sent it certified. We requested budget statements, reserve records, expenditures, beautification invoices, all of it. Beverly did not respond. Instead, she decided to grandstand. At the next HOA meeting, she put my property on the agenda. I went. So did Rosalind. So did Hank, Miss Gloria from 2 streets over, and an older retired history teacher named Leonard who had been waiting years for somebody to challenge Beverly in public. The meeting took place in the community rec room, the kind of beige multi-purpose space designed for exactly one thing: making every argument feel dumber under fluorescent lights. Beverly sat at the front with a binder and that same expression she always wore when preparing to speak slowly to people she considered less organized than herself. She started with landscaping updates, pool maintenance, seasonal reminders. Then she pivoted to unauthorized commercial use concerns and said my address out loud like she was announcing a code violation before sentencing. Rosalind stood, calmly, professionally, surgically. She informed the board that my property was lawfully permitted, that the easement resolution was invalid on its face, that any retaliatory fine activity would become part of pending litigation, and that the board was already overdue on a statutory financial records request. You could feel the room tilt. Beverly tried to say financial matters weren't on the agenda. Rosalind replied, "That's unfortunate because the law didn't ask whether they fit your agenda." Even Leonard smiled at that one. What happened next mattered more than anything Beverly said. People started talking. One neighbor said she'd been threatened with escalating fines over a basketball hoop. Another said Beverly had implied she could report a renter to the owner for community disruption. Another admitted he'd paid a questionable violation fee just to avoid hassle. That's the thing about bullies in organized environments. They seem strong right until witnesses compare notes. The room changed. Not all at once, but enough. Beverly ended the meeting early. Outside in the parking lot, 3 homeowners approached us, then 2 more. Then a woman named Patrice told us Beverly had hinted she could make trouble with her rental status if Patrice didn't cooperate with neighborhood standards. Rosalind wrote everything down. And then she found the first truly interesting county record. Beverly had a pending permit application on her own lot. She wanted to build a detached studio structure behind her house, on a lot with an old developer deed restriction limiting additional structures. That restriction had never been removed, so while Beverly was trying to challenge my permitted workshop, she was quietly waiting on approval for a project of her own that might not survive legal scrutiny. Now we had motive, or at least the beginning of one. A few nights later, my security footage caught someone entering the side of my workshop after midnight. Nothing was stolen, but drawers had been touched, papers shifted, a cabinet left barely ajar. Whoever went in was searching for what? Most likely permits, insurance, licensing, anything that could create a real problem where Beverly had only managed to manufacture fake ones. They found nothing useful. What they did leave behind was a timestamp. And by then, Rosalind was already connecting dots in county records tied to Beverly's permit application, HOA behavior, and a buried covenant clause nobody in the neighborhood had paid attention to in years. When she called me that Friday, I was welding gusset plates at my bench. I killed the arc, lifted my hood, and listened. "Garrett," she said, "I think I know what she's after." Turns out there was an old provision in the original development documents involving revenue from certain accessory business structures. It was obscure, outdated, and, most importantly, subject to a deadline that had long expired in my case. But Beverly either didn't notice the expiration language or hoped I hadn't. If she could pressure me into recognizing HOA authority over my workshop, she may have believed she could force some kind of assessment against my business income. That was the first. By the 3rd week of March, the Lexus had been sitting in my workshop for exactly 19 days. I knew because I'd been counting. Every morning, I'd walk out to the gravel drive, the cold air hitting my face, and look at that silver sedan sitting under the fluorescent workshop lights like some kind of trophy Beverly had claimed and forgotten about. The car never moved. Nobody came to retrieve it. There were no calls, no follow-up notices, nothing but silence, and the certainty that Beverly was waiting for me to blink first. She didn't understand that I'd stopped blinking. Rosalind called me on a Tuesday afternoon while I was inventory checking welding rod stock. She had finished her county records deep dive and wanted to walk me through the legal landscape before suggesting next moves. "The easement is dead," she said without preamble. "The commercial zoning protects you. The financial disclosure non-compliance gives us leverage, and the revenue share clause in the original covenants expired in 2020, 5 years before Beverly ever joined the board." I asked what that meant in plain language. "It means she's chasing a ghost. She thinks she has authority she doesn't have. She built this whole escalation on a misreading of outdated documents, and now she's trapped because backing down admits the entire thing was theater." I understood then why she'd left the car. It wasn't about the car. It was about proving she could take something and hold it. Proving she had power. Once she acknowledged she didn't have the authority to park it there, she admitted everything else had been bluff. So she was waiting. And I was done waiting. That night I called Trent. He came over with his truck and I explained what I wanted to do. He listened carefully, and when he finished, he nodded once and said, "That's legal?" "Completely." "Then I'm in." The plan was simple. Not destructive, not illegal, but absolutely irreversible without heavy equipment. I was going to weld a reinforcement frame into the interior of my workshop's main door, not blocking the car, not damaging the car, not even touching the car, but installing a structural modification that would make rolling that Lexus out through the main entrance mathematically impossible without disassembling the frame with a cutting torch. The car could still be in there, but getting it out would require an acetylene rig and someone qualified to operate one. It would require, in other words, asking for my help. "Why not just tow it?" Trent asked as we looked at the doorframe. Because the moment I do, Beverly claims I interfered with HOA property or her vehicle or community equipment, creates noise in the legal proceedings, gives her something to point at and say, "See, he's being unreasonable." This way, the car sits exactly where she put it, untouched, undamaged, perfectly safe. But the door configuration changes. Trent grinned. That's spiteful in a really intelligent way. Thank you. I pulled my original building modification permit, verified the door frame reinforcement would fall within acceptable structural parameters, and designed a clean, professional installation. Steel tubing welded at precise angles, creating a 6-inch diameter access frame through which a standard car could not pass without removal or disassembly. We started the first night at 9 o'clock. Trent brought his truck with a generator and welding rig. I had everything else ready. Steel stock, grounding cable, safety equipment, a thermos of coffee strong enough to power a small machine. The work itself was rhythmic. Pull helmet down, strike the arc, watch the metal flow, listen to the particular white noise of a quality weld cooling. This was the part of my trade that still felt like prayer to some people. Just me, the steel, the heat, and the muscle memory of 10,000 similar joints. By midnight, the first corner of the frame was solid. We quit to avoid drawing attention, packed the equipment, and waited until the neighborhood went completely quiet. The second night, we finished the job. By 2 in the morning, the door frame modification was complete, professional, structurally sound, permitted under my building modification documentation, and 100% effective. The Lexus was staying put. I photographed every inch of work with timestamps. I documented the installation photos. I made notes. I pulled the modification permit certificate again and filed it with the county for the record. Then I made one more upgrade. 4 high-definition security cameras with cloud backup. 2 on the workshop exterior, 2 on the interior. 24-hour recording. Motion-activated exterior lighting so bright they'd illuminate the driveway like a stadium if anyone approached after dark. Clyde helped with the camera wiring. He didn't ask many questions, just showed up with a thermos of his own coffee and climbed a ladder while I ran cable through the eaves. My neighbor Hank brought food, something his wife made, sausage and potato soup that tasted like it was designed specifically to fuel nights when you were doing the kind of work that required both muscles and strategy. By the second weekend, the file was complete. Legal documents scanned and organized, photos sorted by date, security camera feeds backed up to Rosalind's secure server, the modified door frame solid and unquestionable, every piece of evidence cataloged. I sent copies of everything to Rosalind with a note saying I was taking time off, personal business, 2 weeks. She called immediately. "What are you doing?" "Hawaii," I said. "Darlene and I are going to sit on a beach and pretend none of this exists for a while." "And the car?" "Stays in the workshop. Door modified per my building permit. Everything documented, everything legal. The modifications are professional and safe. The car is undamaged. If Beverly or anyone else wants to remove it, they'll need my help with the cutting torch, or they'll need the county to order it removed. Either way, I'm documented and protected." Silence on the line. Then, "That's brilliant and petty in equal measure. I'm aiming for both." "When do you leave?" "Tomorrow morning. Early flight." Before I went inside to pack, I posted one photo to the neighborhood Facebook group. The workshop exterior in golden hour light, the welded door frame clearly visible, the whole image professional and deliberate. Caption: "Workshop upgrades complete. Back in 2 weeks. Don't touch my stuff." Then I put my phone in airplane mode. What happened next would unfold without me watching it happen. That was the point. By setting everything up legally, photographically, and structurally before leaving, I'd created a situation that Beverly couldn't resolve without either accepting defeat or escalating in ways that would make her look worse. She would choose the latter. She always did. The first thing that happened, I found out later from Hank, was that Beverly called an emergency HOA board meeting and voted to fine me $250 per day for unauthorized structural modification to an accessory structure. It was such a perfect mistake that Rosalind laughed when she forwarded me the notice while I was sitting in a Maui resort reading the brief on my phone between snorkeling sessions. Beverly had officially acknowledged 2 things. First, that a vehicle is in my locked workshop, and second, that the car is associated with her or the HOA somehow, which meant she'd officially admitted trespass. Rosalind sent a response immediately. citing the court stay from the quiet title action Rosalind had filed, explaining that no enforcement action could be taken during pending litigation, and forwarding copies to the HOA's insurance carrier with a professional note suggesting they advise their client about taking enforcement actions in violation of an active court order. The HOA's insurance carrier called Beverly the same day. I know because my neighbor Hank got a call from Clifford, the HOA treasurer, who was apparently having a crisis of conscience. Clifford told Hank, who recorded the conversation with permission, that the insurance company's attorney had told Beverly to cease all enforcement activity immediately, and that if she didn't, the carrier was considering withdrawing coverage. That meant if Beverly continued escalating, she'd be doing it without legal protection. It meant any lawsuit against her personal assets became possible. Clifford also mentioned, in what sounded like a man genuinely panicking, that Beverly had paid a private attorney $6,400 from the beautification fund to draft additional enforcement documents. $6,400 from the community fund for a personal legal dispute, in a community with dues of only $480 per year. That was misappropriation. That was theft, technically, depending on how the attorney structured the charge, and Clifford had signed off on it. While I was watching sea turtles drift past coral reefs in water so clear it looked like glass, my neighbor was experiencing what I can only describe as the financial equivalent of vertigo. Back at home, in the actual physical world I'd temporarily left behind, Beverly was about to discover what happens when you corner yourself. Because she still had one move left, and it would be the one that actually broke her case wide open. Hawaii was perfect in the way vacations are when you're not supposed to be thinking about legal warfare, but you're thinking about it anyway. Darlene had finally stopped holding her shoulders up around her ears. She'd gotten sun on her face. She was laughing again in that particular way that meant the tension had actually loosened, instead of just being temporarily ignored. We watched sunset from a black sand beach. We ate fish we couldn't pronounce. We existed for 7 full days without checking Ohio time or legal documents. Then on day 8, while I was checking messages during a brief Wi-Fi window at the resort, I saw that Beverly had made move number 2. She'd filed a regulatory complaint with the Ohio Department of Commerce's Industrial Commission, claiming my welding business was operating without proper licensing. It was a charge that was demonstrably false, and verifiably so within minutes of actual investigation, but that wasn't the point. The point was administrative harassment, filing complaints not because they had merit, but because responding to them consumed time, created stress, and occasionally generated paperwork errors that could be weaponized later. Rosalind had prepared for this. She sent a response package within 24 hours, completely thorough, backed by full documentation, with a cover letter noting this was the second time Beverly had directed regulatory attention toward my property, and that we were now formally reserving the right to pursue malicious prosecution claims if the pattern continued. What Beverly didn't know, what she couldn't have known because Rosalind kept her cards completely private, was that the county recorder's office had just completed its review of the easement challenge. The preliminary finding was devastating for Beverly. The resolution was defective on its face. The easement recording would be vacated. My private drive was declared exclusively private, legally and permanently. Beverly's permit application, meanwhile, had run into its own catastrophe. The county's drainage easement review had flagged an encroachment issue. A structural hold had been placed on her application pending survey amendment, and given the actual geometry of her lot, that amendment was essentially impossible without a complete redesign. She was hemorrhaging on multiple fronts and didn't understand why. What she understood even less was that I'd discovered all of it before I left for vacation. I knew about the permit hold, I knew about the deed restriction, I knew about the drainage encroachment. I had filed all of it away as background noise, waiting for the right moment to detonate it. But Beverly wasn't waiting. Beverly was panicking, and panicked people make decisions that crush them. On day 10 of our trip, while Darlene was reading on the beach, I got a call from Cassidy Bellamy. She was a reporter for the local paper, the Harrowfield Courier-Dispatch, circulation about 4,000, published twice a week, covering neighborhood news, municipal updates, the kind of local journalism that usually consisted of profiles of new storefronts and municipal budget meetings. But Cassidy had been paying attention. She'd noticed the ombudsman inquiry that Gloria had filed. She'd caught wind of the court filings. She'd seen the pattern of Beverly's behavior and decided it might be worth looking into. She asked if I'd be willing to provide comment and documentation for a story about HOA governance issues and community authority overreach. I was still in Hawaii. I was still supposed to be ignoring all of this, but Cassidy's tone suggested she was going to write the story regardless, and I had a choice between cooperating or leaving her to figure it out alone. "I'll send you everything," I told her. "Everything, everything? Every document, every photo, every timeline, every piece of the file. You want to understand this, I'll make sure you can." I called Rosalind and asked her to compile the full package: permits, covenants, county records, security footage, the whole architecture of what Beverly had attempted and how it failed legally. Then I went back to watching the ocean and pretending I was a man on vacation. Cassidy worked for 4 days verifying everything independently. She pulled the actual covenant documents, she called the county, she reviewed the court filings, she interviewed the code enforcement officer, she talked to neighbors. She didn't just accept my file, she investigated it and confirmed it. Her follow-up story ran on a Tuesday while I was still 2,000 miles away from Ohio. The headline read, "HOA President Used Community Fund to Finance Personal Legal Battle Against Homeowner." The subheading explained, "Records and interviews reveal pattern of escalating enforcement actions tied to disputed property dispute." The story itself was careful, fair, documented, and absolutely devastating. It detailed Beverly's attempt to claim easement authority. It explained the covenant violation, the $6,400 misappropriation from the beautification fund. It quoted her own words about enforcement. It laid out the timeline in a way that showed clear pattern and intent. And it named Clifford as having authorized the check. Poor Clifford. He'd been trying to stay neutral in a situation where neutrality was no longer possible. Now his name was in print, attached to the misappropriation, and his phone was probably ringing off the hook. The story also noted that the newspaper had been contacted by Beverly's office requesting a chance to provide comment, but that Beverly had declined to respond to specific allegations about the fund expenditure or the pattern of enforcement actions. Decline to respond was a nice way of saying she'd gone silent, because there was nothing she could say that would make it better. The moment that story hit print, everything shifted. I was still in Hawaii, Darlene was still reading on the beach, the Lexus was still in my workshop, door frame modification still solid, camera footage still running. But in Ohio, the calculus of the situation had completely changed. Beverly went from being the person enforcing community standards to being the person who'd been caught misappropriating community money while filing retaliatory enforcement actions against a homeowner whose property was legally protected. That's not a subtle pivot, that's a collapse. The court hearing for the quiet title action was scheduled for the Thursday after the story ran. The Commonplace Courthouse, Franklin County, 9:30 in the morning, Judge Patricia Gale presiding. I flew back on a red-eye Tuesday night, landed Wednesday morning, and spent Wednesday in Rosalind's office reviewing testimony strategy. By that point, Beverly's insurance carrier had formally withdrawn their support. Her private attorney had requested a continuance. The county attorney's office was looking at her financial records. The ombudsman was investigating her governance practices. Rosalind looked across her desk at me and said, "She has no play left. She can't withdraw the resolution without admitting it was improper. She can't defend it because it is improper. She can't explain the fund misappropriation. She can't claim she didn't escalate because we have documentation of every escalation." What does she do? Whatever she does, she loses. The courtroom on Thursday morning was fuller than anyone expected for what should have been a routine quiet title proceeding. 23 homeowners from Harrowfield Estates, the county ombudsman's office representative, Cassidy Bellamy with her notepad, a reporter from the Columbus Metro desk with a camera bag. Clifford was there, separated from Beverly, with his own attorney, looking like a man who'd made some very costly decisions and was now paying the bill. Judge Patricia Gale came in with a file that was approximately 4 inches thick. She was a woman in her early 60s with the bearing of someone who had permanently run out of patience for people creating preventable problems. She sat down, reviewed the documents briefly, and looked up at the HOA's representation. They'd sent a paralegal, a nervous young person in a suit that didn't quite fit, sent to request the continuance in person because nobody wanted to face Judge Gale directly. She asked the paralegal if the HOA had any evidence that the easement resolution had been submitted to a homeowner supermajority. The paralegal said they weren't authorized to speak to the merits. Judge Gale said that was unfortunate because she was going to rule on them anyway. And then she did. She vacated the easement recording. She declared my private drive exclusively private, in perpetuity, with no HOA authority over access or use. She issued an injunction prohibiting the HOA from taking any enforcement action against my property, pending a full governance review. She referred the financial disclosure non-compliance to the county attorney's office for civil investigation, and she noted on the record that the board's documented pattern of conduct was consistent with retaliatory enforcement prohibited under Ohio state statute. The whole thing took 9 minutes. Rosalind allowed herself a very small smile. The paralegal was already gathering papers, looking for the nearest exit. Outside the courtroom, 3 homeowners came up to congratulate me, then 2 more, then Patrice, who had been renting for 6 years and had decided to finally purchase her lot once the Beverly chaos ended. The moment the courthouse doors closed behind us, I wanted to drive straight to the workshop, but first I called Trent. I told him, "It's done. The court ruled. The easement is gone. We're clear." He said, "Then let's get that car out of your shop." The court had sided with me completely. Beverly's easement was gone, her authority was stripped, her fund misappropriation was under investigation, but the Lexus was still sitting in my workshop, and getting it out would require using the cutting torch on the frame I'd welded. What happened when I drove straight from the courthouse to my shop, the afternoon light turning that particular shade of golden that means autumn is getting serious about its intentions. The neighborhood was quiet in the way it usually is on a Thursday afternoon, everyone either at work or pretending they don't notice their neighbor's legal victory being processed in real time. The workshop sat exactly as it had for 4 weeks. Lexus inside, frame modifications solid, cameras running, everything documented. I called Trent and told him to bring the cutting rig and a flatbed tow truck. While I waited, I walked the perimeter of the building and noticed something I'd missed before. There were fresh scrape marks on the concrete floor near the Lexus's rear tires. Someone had tried to move the car. Recently, probably in the last day or two before the court ruling made things even more impossible. I photographed the marks with my phone, time-stamped. Then I downloaded the security footage. 4 cameras, continuous recording, cloud backed up, all accessible from my phone. I scrolled through and found a timestamp from the previous Saturday at 2:47 a.m. 2 individuals in dark clothing, hats, moving carefully. One had what looked like a slim gym tool. They spent 45 minutes inside the workshop before leaving without the car. The footage was grainy, night vision mode, no supplementary lighting on that side of the building, but one of the figures had a distinctive gait. A slight lean to the right, left shoulder marginally higher than the right, the kind of asymmetry that comes from a chronic hip issue. I'd watched Beverly walk across parking lots enough times that I recognized the posture. I uploaded the footage to Rosalind's secure server without comment. By the time Trent arrived with the cutting rig and the flatbed tow truck, the sun was getting lower. Clyde showed up too, business partner, good friend, the kind of person who doesn't ask too many questions when you need help with something important. I'd sent Beverly's attorney formal notice that morning. The vehicle would be removed from my property at 4 p.m., pursuant to the court's injunction and pursuant to Ohio tow and storage law. Storage fees had been accumulating at the commercial rate since the day of first trespass. She could pay the bill and get her car, or she could dispute it in court and face the judge who had just ruled her on every single point. Rosalind submitted the invoice to Beverly's attorney the next morning. The response came back before noon. Beverly would be paying the bill. The Lexus was released from the tow lot that afternoon. I never saw it again. The moment the tow truck left my driveway, Bud came over with a cooler. Inside was cold beer and the kind of satisfaction that comes from watching something complicated finally resolve. Gloria brought a sheet cake she'd made. Harlan, the retired history teacher from the April HOA meeting, brought lawn chairs and a thermos of coffee. Patrice drove down from her house. Even Tamsin, the board member who'd signed the resolution thinking it was about landscaping, showed up looking apologetic but present. And that matters, actually. Presence matters. We stood in the gravel driveway in that golden light, the workshop doors propped open behind us, the smell of the cooling season mixing with the last warmth of late afternoon. Somebody made a toast. I don't remember the exact words, just the sound of it. That particular quality of laughter that only happens when a group of people who've been holding their breath for a long time finally breathes out. Cassidy Bellamy came by to photograph it. The photo ran in the Courier-Dispatch the following Tuesday. Neighbors gathered to celebrate court victory and the conclusion of contentious HOA property dispute. There was cake in the photo. Real community. The kind of neighborhood moment that happens when people decide to actually show up for each other instead of hiding behind HOA rules and neighborhood hierarchies. What happened in the weeks that followed would matter more than the immediate victory, though. Because a ruling on a piece of paper is one thing, but actually changing how a community functions? That's harder. Beverly resigned from the HOA board 2 weeks after the court decision, announcing her departure in a letter that described it as a personal decision to pursue other interests, the understated way of saying, "I have lost all authority, all credibility, and all interest in continuing." Clifford Ainsley, meanwhile, had panicked himself into actual cooperation. His attorney reached out to Rosalind with an offer. Clifford would provide a full written statement about how Beverly had directed the $6,400 expenditure from the beautification fund, had threatened him with exposure of other irregularities if he refused to sign the check, and had essentially bullied him into participating in financial misappropriation. In exchange, Clifford wanted limited liability consideration. It was an interesting calculation, Clifford facing either continued association with Beverly or betrayal of her. He chose the latter. The county attorney's civil investigation into the beautification fund took 6 months. By the end, it was clear that Beverly had treated the community fund as a personal discretionary account. Receipts were missing. Invoices were fabricated. The whole thing was sloppy enough that it would have collapsed under any serious audit. Clifford paid a fine and was required to complete a fiduciary responsibility course. He's still on the board now, under new leadership, and by Bud's account, he's become almost annoyingly meticulous about documentation, like a man overcorrecting for past sins. Tamsin Voy was cleared of any knowing wrongdoing by the Ombudsman inquiry. She became the board's recording secretary and instituted a policy requiring all members to receive plain English summaries of any document before signing. Small improvement, meaningful one. Beverly's permit application for her studio structure was formally denied 6 weeks after the court ruling, the denial notice citing the drainage easement encroachment and the deed restriction she'd never disclosed. She never reapplied. And Bud Fetter, my neighbor with 4 citations noticed over 2 years, ran for HOA board president in the spring election and won unopposed. His first acts as president were commissioning a full audit of the previous 2 years' finances, hiring an actual management company to handle administrative functions, and reducing the annual HOA dues by $120 once the financial irregularities were properly accounted for and remedied. The neighborhood had shifted. Not dramatically, not visibly in the way that would make the streets look different, but in the way that matters. People stopped being afraid of arbitrary enforcement, stopped wondering if their choices would trigger some official notice, started thinking of the HOA as a service rather than a threat. My business had its best year in 2023. Part of that was good contract work, yes, but part of it was that the legal process had forced me to get every piece of documentation absolutely perfect. Business permits, licensing, insurance, certifications, tax records, everything categorized and current. Having that foundation made bidding on larger municipal and commercial contracts significantly easier. The lesson there is not subtle. Paperwork you do reluctantly to defend yourself often becomes the foundation for something bigger than the original fight. And then there was the scholarship. Gloria Toss proposed using the $6,400 that eventually was recovered from the beautification fund, plus matching contributions from 14 neighbors to establish something permanent, the Harrowfield Estates Trade Skills Scholarship. Named for my father, Dale, who'd spent 40 years as a union ironworker before his heart gave out in 2019. Awarded annually to a graduating senior from our local high school pursuing a career in the skilled trades, welding, pipe fitting, electrical, HVAC, carpentry, any of it. The first scholarship went to a kid named Bennett who was enrolled in a welding certification program at the community college. He came to the neighborhood summer cookout the following June to say thank you, shook my hand, looked me in the eye. And I thought about my father dropping that come-along chain on the workshop floor all those years ago, and the two of us laughing until we cried. That building, the one Beverly had tried to claim, the one she had planted a Lexus in, the one she had filed enforcement actions against, had been used for something good. The car was gone, the lawsuit was won, Beverly was gone, the neighborhood was healing. But the real story— I want to circle back to something I said at the beginning, because it matters now in a way it didn't when the fight was still happening. This wasn't really about a Lexus in my workshop. It wasn't about an easement or a resolution or HOA authority or even the $6,400 that Beverly stole from the community fund. It was about what happens when someone decides that systems are tools for personal power and nobody's watching carefully enough to stop her. It was about what changes when that assumption turns out to be wrong. In the months after the court ruling and the lawsuit conclusion, I spent time thinking about the different paths that situation could have taken. Beverly could have moved the car immediately when I pushed back legally. That would have made her look reasonable and let her live to fight another day. Instead, she doubled down. She filed complaints. She escalated. She tried administrative harassment. And each escalation created more documentation, more witnesses, more irrefutable evidence of pattern. Clifford could have refused to cooperate with Beverly's demand for the check. That would have stopped the misappropriation before it happened. Instead, he signed. He participated. And when his conscience caught up with his actions, he flipped. His testimony was the domino that made every other domino fall. I could have simply towed the Lexus immediately, like any reasonable person would have done. That would have been easier, faster, less legally complex. Instead, I waited. I documented. I modified my building legally. I set a trap made entirely of accurate information and lawful action, and I left town so she'd have to make decisions without watching me. Hank could have minded his own business instead of noticing the pattern of enforcement letters. He could have not mentioned the budget inconsistency. He could have stayed neutral. Instead, he showed up at the April HOA meeting. He recorded Clifford's confession call. He brought food while I was working nights. He decided that the neighborhood mattered enough to get involved. Gloria could have sent that community letter to nobody, could have assumed nobody else was frustrated enough to sign it. Instead, she got 21 signatures. She submitted it to the ombudsman. She proposed the scholarship. She made the abstract concept of community standards into an actual human institution with a name and a purpose. And Cassidy Bellamy could have written a straightforward story about a neighborhood dispute without digging deeper. Instead, she spent 4 days verifying every detail. She called the county. She reviewed the legal filings. She did the actual work of journalism when she could have just printed Beverly's version and called it balanced. That's the architecture of how bad situations actually get fixed. Not by one person, not by legal system alone, not by documentation alone, but by a combination of people deciding that they're not going to hide, that they're going to participate, that they're going to show up even when showing up costs something. Here's the thing I understand now that I didn't fully understand during the fight itself. Bullies in organized environments thrive on 3 specific conditions. First, most people are busy. You have a job, you have a family, you have medical stuff, bills, a life that consumes your attention. That busyness is real and legitimate, but it creates space for someone willing to be focused and relentless. Second, most people are conflict averse. Stress creates stress. Stress is bad, so we tend towards silence and compliance, even when compliance enables something we don't actually support. That's not moral failure, that's just human nature, but it does give cover to people who have no such aversion. Third, most people assume the system will work. They assume if something is really wrong, somebody will stop it. A judge will rule, an attorney will intervene, the county will investigate. And they assume this without actually watching the system or participating in it. They assume it's working even when nobody's actually watching to see if it works. Beverly assumed all 3 of those things about my neighborhood. She assumed everyone was too busy to notice the pattern of enforcement. She assumed everyone was too conflict-averse to show up and say no publicly. And she assumed that if someone tried to challenge her, the system would default to giving institutional authority the benefit of the doubt. The moment Hank started paying attention, those assumptions started cracking. The moment Gloria organized the letter, they cracked further. The moment Cassidy verified the documents instead of just accepting Beverly's framing, they shattered. By the time I came back from Hawaii and the court date happened, Beverly wasn't facing a homeowner with a legal grievance. She was facing a community that had decided to actually participate. And that's a completely different thing. In the months and years that followed, I kept watching how the neighborhood changed, not in dramatic ways, but in the texture of how people interacted. Hank and Bud started having actual conversations with neighbors instead of just formal HOA interactions. Gloria's scholarship committee became a standing thing. They meet quarterly to review applications, and they've expanded the award to recognize different career paths because the need is bigger than one annual scholarship. Tamsin became genuinely invested in making the HOA transparent instead of just going through the motions. Patrice bought her house instead of renting, and she's been helping newer residents understand how to navigate property ownership. Cassidy got promoted to a bigger beat at the Columbus Metro, but she still covers local government with the same thoroughness that broke Beverly's case. She's trained other reporters on document verification. She's become someone you can actually count on to do the work instead of just repeat claims. And me? I kept building things. The workshop became a real small business instead of a side operation. I took on more complex projects. I hired help. I taught some classes at the community college on fabrication technique because Bennett, the first scholarship recipient, asked if I would, and I couldn't think of a good reason to say no. The scholarship kept growing. We've awarded it to 17 students now, and every single one of them has come back at some point to say thank you and talk about what the money meant. That's the architecture I'm most proud of. Not winning a legal fight, but turning the energy from that fight into something that survives beyond it. Beverly Drummond disappeared from the neighborhood gradually. Her house is still there. She might still live in it. I honestly don't know because I stopped paying attention to her the moment she resigned from the board. And that's important. Not paying attention to people who've already lost the authority to create problems is its own kind of victory. It means they've stopped taking up real estate in your head. The last thing I want to say about all of this is that I don't tell this story to encourage legal warfare as entertainment or neighborhood conflict as spectacle. That's not the point. The point is that systems, legal systems, institutional systems, organizational systems, only function the way they're supposed to function when people actually watch them, when people actually participate, when people are willing to show up and say no even when saying no costs something. Most of the time, most of us are content to assume the system is working fine without us. But it's not working fine without us. It's not working at all. It's just operating on default settings, which means anyone willing to be shameless and relentless can take control of it for personal purposes. That's not a legal system problem, that's a participation problem. The moment Beverly realized she wasn't operating in a vacuum, that someone was actually watching, that documents were actually being reviewed, that her claims were actually being checked against records, the entire structure of her authority collapsed. Because her authority wasn't based on actual power, it was based on the assumption that nobody was paying attention enough to notice it was fake. That assumption turned out to be optimistic on her part, and from that specific miscalculation came everything that followed: the court ruling, the scholarship, the changed neighborhood, the whole fabric of things shifting towards something better. I still have a lot of documents in files, court documents, county records, photos, footage, all of it organized and preserved in case it's ever relevant again. But mostly it just sits there, and that's fine, because sometimes the value of documentation isn't in using it, it's in having it. The simple act of saying to someone trying to take power they don't have, "I'm paying attention, I'm writing this down, and when you're done, we're going to see what it all looked like in retrospect." That single fact, that someone, anyone, is paying attention, turns out to be the most powerful deterrent against this kind of thing existing in the first place. I still drive past the workshop every morning, still smell the cold concrete, the old welds, the metal and oil and memory of my father. Still see the spot where Hank brought soup, where Gloria stood with her cake, where Cassidy took photos, where Patrice decided to stop renting and start building something permanent. And I think about what almost happened if I just towed the car quietly. Probably nothing would have changed. Beverly would have moved on to the next target. The HOA would have kept operating in the dark. The scholarship would never have existed. The neighborhood would still be a place where people felt watched and controlled, instead of like a community. But we didn't just tow the car. And that choice, to document instead of just remove,